Hi there, my name's Giles Crosse and I am ISEAL Associate Manager for Content Strategy, and I'm here today in conversation with Sheila Senathirajah, who is ISEAL's Head of Social Impact, and we are looking at the complexities of equity and livelihoods, plus how credibility has a catalysing power for foundational change.
Thanks, Giles. So within ISEAL, our work in this area currently emphasizes improvement of income, equitable treatment, and sustainable livelihoods for smallholder farmers. Over the last couple of years, I think we've made a lot of progress in building partnerships with key organizations working on this topic, building our understanding and providing clarity to practitioners who are working on this. However, I would say that we still face a lot of challenges in scaling impact, and that's where a lot of our current and future focus is going to be on.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. I'm always really into real world impacts. I think it's kind of the reason that we do this stuff in the first place. So it'll be fascinating to talk a little bit more about that down the line. Maybe you can just run me through what you consider, just for maybe some of the people out there who might not be quite so up to speed with these terms, what the wider sustainability world considers equity and livelihoods to mean, and just how widely these terms are well understood and how far down the conversation is in terms of priority to businesses or policymakers and NGOs and consumers out there.
So I would say, especially over the last couple of years with the regulations that are coming down the pipelines, these concepts are increasingly being understood as key to sustainability, but interpretations do vary. And that's why a large part of our work is focused on building consensus around a common language. That's really important to really just get down to the basics of what are we all talking about? What are we referring to? Having a common language, a common framework for us to use as a reference really then helps us go faster in terms of action. In terms of prioritization, we see increasingly businesses, NGOs, policymakers really beginning to prioritize this, especially with the regulations that are coming through. So it definitely is an important topic that is gaining momentum and speed.
Fantastic. It's good to hear things are moving forwards. I think it's always important to have that. In any kind of shape of sustainability, it's important to have that bottom level of understanding that everyone gets, and then hopefully we develop things moving forward from that basis. So that's encouraging to hear. I wonder if you could, speaking from that basis, I wonder if you could tell me a bit about partnerships and perhaps what might be missing within partnerships, maybe between sustainability systems, businesses and smallholders in terms of equity and livelihoods, and perhaps anything that ISEAL's credibility approach can do to help encourage better partnerships in the real world as well.
Well, that's a good question, because
Cool.
when you look at this topic of equity and livelihoods, the role or the solutions to address it don't just lie with one person. It is a collective effort. But two of the common things that we find that are most lacking in partnerships really is trust and then fair distribution of benefits or risk. So those are the two areas that we really want to keep highlighting is really important. Trust and equitable distribution, either in risk or benefits. So credibility is really a very good framework to put in place processes that can foster better cooperation. It means we're looking at meaningful engagement, we're looking at transparency, we're looking at accountability in partnerships, and all these help to build that trust, build that fairer distribution of risk, of accountability in relationships. So credibility does play that sort of underlying mechanism that helps with these improving these gaps that we're currently seeing in relationships.
Fantastic. I wonder if, and maybe reading between the lines here a little bit, I wonder if you're hinting that trust has been historically kind of lacking in this space between, this is slightly going off our question list, but I wonder if you're hinting that, I don't know, that maybe trust has been slightly lacking in the past between perhaps smallholders and the market, and if that's been historically a problem. Would that be kind of a correct sense I'm getting there, or do you think that would be taking things a little bit too far?
Well, I think people don't realize that trust takes time
Yeah,
But people
exactly.
want to see impact happen very fast.
Right.
And it's not that they intentionally don't focus on it. But I think in just this modern day where we're all rushing to see like the impacts and put down numbers and communicate something, we take a few steps that maybe sort of have a unintended consequence of breaking down that trust. So trust building,
Yeah.
relationship building, it takes time. In my previous job, I did a lot of work on the field with small producers, and
Yeah.
sometimes you just need to spend time just talking to people and hearing people out and responding back to them, and these things take time. And I think as we move forward on this topic, we just have to realize that addressing poverty, addressing inequities takes time, and we have to be conscious of that and put in that time and effort to build that trust.
Fantastic. I think that's fascinating because so often with sustainability and the SDGs, or even climate action, we feel as though everything needs to be done at such pace in order to get things done. So on the one hand, we've got a real hastening and urgency to everything, but then at the same time, it doesn't always help to jump ahead of yourself and rush into things too much. So there's always kind of a dichotomy to balance here, I think, with sustainability and these kind of elements. It would interest me to understand, perhaps you can speak a bit to how ISEAL's credibility experience can help improve livelihoods and equity into forthcoming legislation, because clearly legislation has a really big role to play here. So I'd be very interested in that side of things.
So ISIL has a lot of work in standard setting and ensuring credibility. These are our two sort of strong areas. And these are exactly the kind of things that can help shape policies, making sure that we integrate equity and livelihood considerations more effectively into regulation. So it's not just about one thing, but really putting into place what are the requirements, what are the processes that are needed to address inequities, address poverty as well. So just even understanding what's required under livelihoods improvement, human rights improvement, and then building in the standards for it, ensuring that they all are anchored with incredible processes. So that's one on the standards and the credibility itself. But also what we do as ISIL is we really have a number of dialogues with policymakers, with business influencers, and we ensure that these requirements regularly get embedded into these frameworks. So companies are doing a lot of work in this space as well. So we work with them to make sure that there is guidance for how you embed these kind of processes in.
Fantastic. I think that's really important. I think legislation tends not to work so effectively in a bubble, in my experience.
Absolutely.
So we can have all the regulation in the world, but what really counts is people actually engaging with it and actually trying to do more than what the legislation demands, than necessarily just looking at this tick box exercise. And so I think that's really interesting, talking a little bit about the guidance there. Maybe on a similar theme, we can look at how credibility can help develop new schemes to support underrepresented people, maybe on gender parity, fairer wages, incomes. I'd be fascinated to hear about concepts and guidance work in that space.
Well, as you alluded to in one of the earlier questions, how people interpret these issues can vary. And one of the most important thing is to just be clear the definition of what we're talking about, scope and understanding that. And so with the work that we do, setting transparent, measurable criteria on these topics really helps to promote advancement on this topic, whether it's gender, whether it's livelihoods, whether it's wages, just making sure there's credible guidance and facilitating collective action.
Fantastic. That sounds good to me. Maybe we'll move the conversation on to stakeholders a little bit as well, and the improvements they can influence. I always find this fascinating and really interesting, the balance between smallholders out there, and I guess the localist approach, and then the big international corporates who perhaps by definition might have incredibly different priorities. So I wonder how credibility can help manage these complex and, I guess, competing priorities and needs, and just ways to try and improve these balances of what everybody's seeking from this conversation.
Yeah. So one thing to remember is when we're addressing these issues on equity and livelihoods, everyone has a role to play.
Mm.
The small farmer, the NGO, the civil society, companies, governments, policymakers, they all have a role to play in this, and they all have an ability to influence change on this topic. Credibility can help by balancing the interests, making sure that there's meaningful engagement, making sure voices are clear, well heard, and included, fostering transparency, fair systems that account for diverse needs.
Mm-hmm.
So having these credible processes in place is really important to really just balance out the needs and the diverse needs across the different stakeholders.
Brilliant. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. I think it's also really important to me especially, and I think to pretty much everyone within the sustainability sector, to also look at positive impacts and life improvements. So I'd be really intrigued by any examples you have of life improvements on equitable wages and smallholders, and really how sustainability schemes can help benefit their lives. It would fascinate me to hear some views on that topic.
Yeah, there are a number of examples that you can find out that demonstrate how small-scale producers in different commodities like cocoa and coffee, you'll see a lot of these case examples available, that help not just increase their income, but also stabilize their income through fairer and more equitable pricing and procurement practices.
Yeah.
So there are examples there. Some of our members' sustainability schemes like Fair Trade, they've put in place a series of sort of tools and frameworks that allow for this to happen. So they have not just pricing mechanisms like premium pricing or living income reference pricing, but they also provide capacity building to producers. So it is a complementary approach that they use within their scheme and their standard that helps develop this.
Okay, that's fascinating. Thanks. I think something you spoke about, I think you mentioned stabilization there. That's really interesting to me, because I would imagine that if I were a smallholder working out in Cambodia or Southeast Asia or wherever else I happen to be, I'd probably be facing all sorts of challenges around just the nature of what I produce anyway, right? And rainfall patterns and climate change. It's probably hard enough for me to try and even produce in a stable, sustainable way, let alone without actually trying to manage my cost basis and my customers. And a lot of people coming and going and say, okay, well, you're going to get X amount of money for this crop this time of the year, and then next year maybe this is all going to change, kind of thing. Is there something, I suppose what I'm getting at is there something within the sector which is quite inherently unstable anyway, just in terms of production of these things, and how potentially we could help deal with that side of things with more secure contracting? Or I'm not sure exactly what the answer is, but I feel as though it's a fairly risky sector anyway. Would that be a reasonable assumption, do you think?
Well, that's the thing, right? Like farmers are faced with a number of variables that they have to deal with. I mean, one, the climate, they're looking at their crops, what are they producing? And people often forget that farmers just their income doesn't come from one singular crop. There's multiple crops. Sometimes they also do part-time work as well. So even just a good understanding of a household income, what does it constitute? And recognizing that there is a lot of influence on their direct income. But then there are also forces beyond their influence. So market volatility, trading practices, supply and demand, that all has an impact on the farmer itself, but then he doesn't have that sort of influence over it. So that's why the convening, the dialogues, the understanding of what are the causes of this? Like, how can we help distribute that risk in supply chains so that the farmer is not bearing the burden and the risk of the climate volatility, the price volatility, the demand volatility. So it's not just about pricing and procurement. There's also like production practices. How can we help producers make that more stable? What are good production practices? And then on the market side, what are good pricing and procurement practices? But also just looking at a sector level. What are good practices within a sector? How do you look at the crop, for example? There are sustainable cocoa platforms, there's sustainable palm platforms. So really looking across the commodity, how to make that more sustainable. And then at a landscape level, so even in a jurisdiction, in a place, how can governments and private sector and NGOs and producers work together to see, in that space, how do we manage the land and how do we ensure sustainable land use management is happening? So there are a number of different aspects, and that's why I mentioned just now, income, addressing poverty issues. It's not easy, and it won't materialize very quickly. But if you have trust, if you have credible processes underlying this, you setting yourself in a better footing to really advance on good strategies and good interventions.
Yeah. I think the whole situation here is just so inherently complex. It's such a huge conversation fundamentally. Maybe we can talk a little bit about, I guess, the interplay between voluntary and legislative work on equity and livelihoods. I mean, some people call this the smart mix, or the space where NGOs and businesses and policymakers kind of try and come together to get things done. So I'd be interested in your views on where the interplay sits right now in terms of equity and livelihoods and voluntary and legislative work.
Yeah, so voluntary certifications or voluntary frameworks, they're more of a market-driven approach, and they do offer a lot of flexibility, a lot of innovation to companies to tailor sort of their social and environmental efforts. Regulation is pushing for mandatory corporate accountability. So right now, I feel the interplay between the two is becoming more synergistic. Voluntary standards play a critical role in complementing legal frameworks, especially areas where it's still lacking in terms of guidance on specific topics like livelihoods, human rights issues. Again, the guidance it's not super clear as into what is the scope, what are strategies that actually work to give the desired impact. And that's where voluntary standards, because they've been in this space for so many years and they've looked at what are sustainable practices at the core of it, these and having transparent frameworks that can help communicate this change. These are all really important. So I think it is very synergistic, and I think moving forward we need to see how sustainability systems can be good tools that companies can use as they look to meet these requirements of due diligence. And I think companies will also look at these mandatory regulations as being beneficial for their own practices. So they're not just a tick box exercise, but they really need to be seeing this as something that what we're trying to do is really get more credible practices into the system, and these mandatory regulations just enhance that accountability for them. But the voluntary systems bring those kind of credible frameworks and practices and processes into play.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's what we're always seeking. I like the words. I think the word you used was synergistic a moment or two ago. I like that. I like the sense of NGOs and the voluntary sector and sustainability systems and policymakers and credibility and governments all working together in synergy to get things done. I think that speaks nicely to one of the key challenges of sustainability in general, which is just to get everyone walking the same talk and going down the same path together. Unless that's happening, nothing ever really gets done in the real world, in my experience. So I think that's really important. It leads quite nicely to my next question, actually, about scaling up sustainability systems and the right conditions for small producers, and perhaps how ISEAL's credibility work could help with that. So I'd love to hear your views on that.
So ISEAL really does a lot of work I would look at it in two areas. One is just understanding the topic and hosting space for dialogues to happen. What do we mean by livelihood improvement? We talk about wages, we talk about income. Sometimes it's not so clear. Again, building that common consensus around how we're referring to these and what's the scope. And then two is looking at the systems. At a system level, what needs to be in place? How do we build our monitoring and evaluation programs? How do we look at assurance and verification? How do we look at stakeholder engagement? So on both ends, ISEAL works with sustainability systems and just the wider sort of stakeholders to better understand the topic and what we're looking at and what are and trying to define what are the outcomes that we want to see, what does success look like. And then two is making sure we're also discussing what are the frameworks that are going to help us address this, identify where the issues are, report on the progress, and communicate change. So you might do some things and the results might be detrimental, but it's equally important to report on it so that we can then learn from that and improve. So having in place improvement frameworks is really important, not always looking for, I want success at the start, because you will learn through the improvement framework. So I think both hosting dialogues on the topic, but also hosting dialogues on system improvements that are needed is really important.
And it's actually in the space where we fail, whatever that word might be going to mean, that all the learnings actually come. So I think that's fascinating.
I think just to add to that, there's also the fact that because our members work in a diverse sort of range of commodities and sectors, there is the benefit of just learning across different sectors. Some of these issues cut across, looking at livelihoods across agriculture to aquaculture to mining, looking at child labor issues, looking at poverty issues, and sometimes in different geographic regions as well. So there is the added ability for us to sort of look across different commodities, different geographies, and see, how are people addressing this? What are the conditions under which these strategies work? And how do frameworks help advance action? And what are the kind of collaboration that we need to have in place, and how to make that work successfully?
Absolutely. I think that's really valuable. Maybe you can mention a little bit about ISEAL's credibility principles here as well, and just the role that those play in terms of scaling better strategies and potentially conditions for the small producers out there.
Our credibility principles put in place a number of requirements that we feel are really important, and these sort of help improve traceability, risk sharing. It elevates and includes voices of the underrepresented groups, and all these are sort of the things that you want to have in place to improve the conditions for small producers. So even just making sure that, hey, we're looking at all the different elements that are needed. We're not just focusing on one element of just improved pricing, for example, but we're really focusing on, we want to build more resilient, more build the sort of connection and frameworks for communication and dialogue between buyers and small producers. So the credibility principles provide like the framework for us to think about what processes and procedures need to be in place so that we're making sure that there is good connection across the supply chains, that there is good access to finance, there's good incentives coming down the pathway, and any benefits and risks are equitably distributed across the chain as well.
Yeah, brilliant. So I think if you're going to develop trust and truthfulness within any elements of sustainability, you have to have such a comprehensive understanding of all the drivers that are involved. And I think that's what you're speaking to a bit as well. And we've mentioned before in this conversation, just the deep complexity of these things is a place where I feel ISEAL has a particular strength, actually.
So I would say that our focus on standard setting, our focus on credible principles, and our focus on collaboration. These three things really help to set out the foundations for more equitable markets. And that's it. Really, I think, these are sort of very core foundations that you need to have in place to ensure that we have the sort of transparency. We know what we're looking at. We're clear on the definitions. We're all speaking from the same sort of language and frameworks. We have the right people at the table with the right representation, so bringing that collaboration together is really important. So I think these foundations really help with the work, and that's why ISEAL's well placed in this space.
Yeah, awesome. That's really important, I think. Maybe we can talk a bit about infrastructure gaps. I think so much about development and small order work and producers has to do with infrastructure. And I'd love to hear your views on how ISEAL's working with governments or corporates out there to try and see if we can create approaches that maybe fill in a few of these gaps within the infrastructure in the future.
The one thing that I think is really important is to make sure that when we start putting down, what are these practices that can help address some of these issues, it is important to have engagement at different levels and make sure the messages are then brought up to the right groups as well. ISEAL hosts conversations with its partners, with producers, for example, the Low Income Community of Practice. We also host conversations with business influencers and companies in the European side. For example, we did our sustainability symposium a couple of months ago, bringing the right people to the room. So hearing, what are the issues on the implementation on the ground? What are the issues that companies as well face? It's not just the large companies, there are a number of medium, small companies along the supply chains that also want to do something, but sometimes struggle with, how do I do this? And how do I do this in my limited capacity? And then making sure that we're thinking about this and working with our members of sustainable systems to think about what are solutions that are able to address these kind of technical barriers. What are solutions that really address the needs of the producers, and then bringing this messaging back to the policymakers, to the government, so that as they define and design their regulations, they're incorporating the challenges, the needs more holistically into the policy framework itself. So I think it's important because ISEAL plays, many hats and sits in many conversations. It's able to sort of bring these messages clearly to the policymakers.
Yeah, I think that's so key, and I think it's really, really intriguing that you've spoken about helping develop legislation in the right way, because you could argue for legislation to have the right real world impact, it has to understand what it's trying to achieve, and it has to be developed in the right way. So the development of legislation is a fundamentally important part here. And I think that speaks a bit to my next question. I was going to ask you a bit about monitoring and reporting and truthfulness and credibility. And it strikes me that the right monitoring and reporting is essential to even be able to define the challenges and the elements that need to be built into legislation in the first place, if that makes sense. So I'd love to hear views on just the monitoring and reporting side as well, and credibility's role there.
I'm going to say having good reporting and monitoring frameworks really help businesses sort of accurately document and communicate what they're doing. And this sort of enhances the transparency in what we want to see. This really helps with sort of just conveying what is happening on the ground. What are you focusing on? Because a lot of the times people will put a statement on a product and say, I'm doing this, but what are you addressing? I'm addressing deforestation, but what does that actually mean? So monitoring and reporting frameworks are really important because it provides a lot more trust in the system, and people then start to believe what is being done, and can also feed into I see that, what are the benefits coming out of that program?
Yeah. I think that's absolutely key. I think there's so many messages being driven through the market at the moment in terms of we're achieving this on deforestation, and we're achieving this with living wage, or we're achieving certain elements that the whole market and the whole messaging can be so opaque at times.
Exactly. And that's why you need to have trust in the system. And I think credible processes, having strong references to good frameworks really help to sort of just put the trust back in, attract more stakeholders to the play. And it also just expands access to fairer conditions, so you have more people coming in because you have a framework that everyone can participate in. It's a bit more collective. It's clear what everyone's doing, what we're achieving, what we're aiming to. So these kind of frameworks, really what we want is trust in the system. and these tools, these mechanisms really help. And if you have these kind of credible processes that back these systems, then we're just on a better pathway to sort of build trust, build stakeholder trust in the system. And this then brings just more engagement from other stakeholders. And then you have that sort of collective sort of momentum on the topic, which is what we want.
Absolutely. I think, I just think all these elements are so important to driving this conversation forwards. And maybe you can speak a bit about, we've mentioned this previously, but it's good to come back to it. Possible ways that credibility can help drive the best reporting on the progress of improvements, because I think it's quite clear that nobody's necessarily saying that we're at the end of this game yet. If anything, we're just right at the very beginning. And so I think I'd be really interested in how credibility can ensure that we're reporting progress correctly as we move further down the path of improvements in this space. So I'd love views on that side of things.
With this kind of frameworks, what we're trying to do is not solve the problem,
right?
But if we have frameworks that are pushing for continual improvement, and they talk about how we can do this, like how are the results from this then being used to then influence change or to change the direction of their strategies, I think that's where you are. So credibility helps us think about just what processes are necessary. Having a good framework provides that sort of transparency on what is happening, what has worked, what has not worked. It gives us insight on conditions where it will work. So a strategy, which might work in Latin America might not work in Asia for different reasons, but it helps the conversations and the dialogues that we're having in different sectors, in different places on under what conditions do these strategies work, without the data, without the evidence, that sort of fails. So again, just making sure that, when we're collecting the data, we're collecting it in a process where we're engaging with stakeholders, we're providing them with enough of the right information so that they're feeding back the right information to us. Just having a good understanding of just what are these credible processes that needs to be in place and how we engage stakeholders and how we're hearing the right perspective from the right stakeholders to feed into it. Then, you bring in information into a framework that exists that is valid, that it's reliable, it's accurate, that we can trust it. And the outputs then, we can use to then say, okay, here are the results from that, and this works or this doesn't work because of these conditions. So I think, just making sure we have those kind of credible processes, good frameworks, having that transparency, the traceability. Again, it builds trust in the system. So it sort of one leads into the other very nicely.
Yeah, cool. That makes really good sense. There was something you mentioned there that interests me, which we hadn't specifically planned to discuss. But something that I've always found really valuable is the localism approach. And you spoke a bit about how approaches might be different in somewhere in South America compared with Southeast Asia or, Africa, wherever we happen to be. So I'd be quite interested to understand a bit more about how we have to combine all these localist elements with the top level approaches that speak to all of these local needs.
Yeah. So that's a good point. And this is where our work across sectors and across geographic regions really do help. And then our work on the issue itself. Right. So we have this body of work on livelihoods and equity. And at the top level, it's just really, as you said, understanding what are the drivers. So what are the drivers for income? You look at production, you look at price, you look at yields, and then we can look at, okay, what strategies then influence these drivers? You can look at production practices, you can look at pricing and procurement practices. We can look at cost production and how you reduce that cost. There are many strategies, but you take this then to one region, and depending on the conditions in that region, whether they have good collective bargaining to influence pricing, or they have good access to technical support, for the improvement of sustainable practices and land management, that differs from region to region. And that's where, the same set of just understanding what are the drivers? What influence livelihoods? What influences improves equity? And then bringing it down and localizing it to the conditions that exist in that area is really important. And we do that, and it's sometimes hard to get to a common place. And one of the things we do is we look at case examples. So
okay, cool, yeah.
We have conversations and dialogues at a high level and sort of define what are these drivers. We bring stakeholders together to define it and be clear, and then we have conversations with within the local regions to just understand what are the conditions that make different strategies work, and what works in what conditions and doesn't work. And having that clarity, then when we go to a different region, it makes that conversations a little easier. So while it's hard, we use case examples and see, which group of actors have come together to work collectively on this. What were the conditions that they leveraged on? What were the disabling conditions in that space?
Yeah, of course.
So understanding what are the factors that influence success or not is really important. So then you have a clear idea of, here are the common drivers for change on the topic. But here are the conditions that enable or disable or hinder the success of the strategies in a specific location. And I think one thing that we do in ISEAL is we tend to document this and communicate this. And that's where, our platforms like Evidencia come in really handy, because that's the space that we're looking at. What's the evidence of things and how are they working, and making sure people are aware of this. There are a number of studies. There's so many studies out there now that there has to be a way that we're helping practitioners access this information that is there, but sometimes it's just hard to sort of synthesize and analyze, like what's working, what's not working.
Of course.
And then disseminating it in a way that people can then use it effectively as they embark on their journey.
Yeah, fantastic. Maybe just to kind of boil down a bit into some of the more overarching issues. Do you feel that solutions to tackle poverty are really working yet? And there are issues out there surrounding markets and procurement practice squeezing smallholders. I wonder how you feel the situation genuinely looks out there in the real world at the moment, perhaps a bit beyond the credibility conversation, just really looking at the real world and where things are at would really intrigue me as well, just to get a good sense of what we're really dealing with here.
So I would say the fact that we're talking about these issues, the fact that these issues are now coming up in conversations around regulations is a plus point. Previously, I think there was a lot more focus on environmental issues, but these kind of issues on more on the social side, because it was harder to understand, it was more complex.
Yeah, of course.
There was less dialogue, there's less conversation around, how do we build credible frameworks on this and so forth. And I feel, yes, it is good that these dialogues are happening. It's good that there is a desire to work and understand them. I do feel that impact on these topics take a long time to materialize. And the minute you open one conversation, it leads into another conversation around there are all the other issues that we have not resolved that also contribute to this topic. So the fact that the conversations and dialogues are happening is a positive one. There is progress, but there are a number of gaps that remain as well. And this is where I think ISEAL's work on helping to document and disseminate knowledge on just how is this topic advancing is really important. ISEAL's role to convene and host conversations in this space, so regularly just bringing together at the production level or policymakers or businesses or cross stakeholder engagement is really important to understand the needs, the challenges, and then potential solutions. And then ISEAL's work with its members to really get into the solutions. What works? What doesn't work? How do we ensure that there are frameworks and that there are underlying credible process that feed into this, that helps put the trust back in the system again. I think that is really important.
Yeah, brilliant. I think I'd like to just quickly. I think you mentioned something a moment ago about the differences here between environmental challenges and kind of social challenges, I would imagine that it's quite easy to come at an environmental challenge, and you can say, we want to use satellite imagery to monitor deforestation, right? We can use science to do this, and then we can look at the metrics of how deforestation is changing. Would it be reasonable to say that it's harder to drive that kind of approach down into production or living income or wage because there are so many more surrounding factors around it? I just wonder, I think you've hinted at a difference there in terms of complexity, unless I've misunderstood, and I would just be quite interested to understand a bit more about that.
It is different. It is easier with relatively easier with
Yeah.
environmental issues. You can see it in some cases, like you
Mm,
say, with pollution and deforestation, you can get that kind of satellite
yeah.
imagery. It's
Yeah.
how you also access the information and what's
Mm,
happening, and I think this goes across the broad range of social issues. You
yeah.
need to
Yeah.
have a way to understand what the issue is, and I feel again
Mm,
there is that lack of just a common understanding of what we mean by
yeah. Yeah.
livelihoods. It's just what are we referring to? So having that common definitions is really important. And then trying to get information on, does it exist?
Hmm.
Is this issue prevalent here? What are we using to measure it? What are we using to communicate progress on whether improvements are happening? That also needs to be there. So there's a lot more focus now, and that's why I say
Mm,
there is progress being made in these spaces, especially on livelihoods. There's been a lot more progress that's been made, which is very encouraging, and I think it's just opened up the conversation for more spaces where we really need to address. I think what we, again, coming back to what I said at the start, what we're still
mm,
lacking is scale. We
yeah.
understand some
Yeah.
things, we have defined some things, we've got some frameworks in place, we've got some of these
Mm,
right dialogues and spaces for engagement there. We really need to think about how do we scale this impact that we want
yeah.
to see, and that's where it's still a bit of a, how do we do this? And hopefully then
Mm, yeah.
with voluntary systems in place, with the mandatory regulations in place, you know, it will help us sort of advance in that scaling. It will sort of put the agenda on the table and help push some action in this space.
Yeah, I think scaling is absolutely fundamental. I mean, I had a couple of more slightly controversial questions, I guess, to kind of finish our conversation with. I mean, something that I've seen a lot down the years across the world, and there's been an issue, has been corruption.
Mhm.
Whether that's within the wider market space or potentially within various governments across the world. It feels like a very difficult challenge to me, and I'd just love to hear what your experience speaks to in that sense.
So corruption happens because things are so opaque and no one can
Right.
sort of pinpoint who
Yeah, yeah,
and where
yeah.
it's coming from. And also the fact that there are no channels for reporting
Mm,
on this, and no
okay.
one then is held accountable for it. And what credibility does, and that this is one thing I really feel very strongly about, is that
Mm,
credibility mechanisms put in place the kind of processes that help drive transparency. And this in turn will help sort of mitigate some of the risks that we're seeing with corruption. So you have
mhm.
third party audits, for example.
Yeah,
You
thank you.
have spaces for elevating voices of different stakeholder groups, underrepresented groups, so that they have a voice and these gets logged
Mm,
somewhere. So these kind of mechanisms that are put in place really help to sort of break down that opaqueness and make
yeah.
things more transparent. It allows for information flow, it allows for traceability, and we can see what's happening. And it opens the doors and sort of curbs the ability for corruption to thrive. You see, you're sort of
Mm,
breaking down those
mm,
kind of conditions
yeah.
that enable corruption to happen.
Right, I'm
And
with
I
you.
think
Yeah.
credibility mechanisms really help sort of put these transparency, traceability elements in place so that it's clearer and then there's nowhere to hide anymore. And people are held accountable.
That's what we want to see. I don't know if you've got any wider views on how global markets could could improve their role in things. The global marketplace is just so inherently complex, isn't it? And I just wonder if it's fundamentally driven by something very different to looking after producers and equity at its core. But perhaps that's going a step too far. I don't know.
I think, there's only so much you can do in terms of having credible frameworks, a better understanding on the issue, having dialogues. I think at a much higher level, when you talk about global markets, they need to really come together and make some. I don't want to use the word commitment, because there's so many commitments out there, but a commitment to doing something, not to a target, but that we are going to put in place, for example, due diligence on our supply chains, and we're going to commit to that. And knowing that there are frameworks and there are systems in place to help them with that makes it easier. But I think, there has to be some unity that everyone recognizes they have a role to play, whether they're a large brand, whether they're a retailer, whether they're a trader, whether they're just a distributor, that everyone has a role to play, and they're committed to taking actions to reduce the risk and distribute it more equally across all the actors. I think that's the level, that's the kind of commitment that I think we want to see, not commitments to resolving these issues, commitment to improving the processes that we all work within.
Intriguing stuff. I just thought we might close our conversation with a little bit about human rights. And my sense is that equity and livelihoods are fundamentally about human rights.
Absolutely.
Really.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if you could maybe help us close by just speaking a little bit about how credibility can help drive the significance of these things for governments and the world's multinational corporations out there, because this stuff is core to sort of fundamentals of humanity and all the ways that we should and shouldn't be living, I think. And I'd just love to hear your views on that to help close out our chat on these issues.
So to me, credibility drives the increasing recognition on equity and livelihoods as human rights issues. Yeah. So we want people to recognize this. And that is growing now. We see that happening.
Yeah.
And what it does is then push governments, push multinationals to really take meaningful action. Not to solve the problem, because again, we can't solve the problem immediately. Sure. But you can take meaningful action. You can start looking at your supply base. You can start understanding where the risks are, where the issues are. You can start mitigating and addressing and mitigating these issues. You can start doing these kind of meaningful actions. So that's what credibility does. It brings recognition on the issue, and it pushes governments, multinationals to take meaningful action. And that's what we want to see moving forward.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sheila. Great speaking with you.
Thanks, Giles.
Thanks so much for listening, and I really hope you enjoyed our podcast on credibility and equity and livelihoods today. If you've got any questions or you'd like any more information, then please don't hesitate to email giles@isealalliance.org. And if you need any more information or you'd like to learn more about ISEAL or our credibility work itself, then please find us online at www.iseal.org.